At the company's anniversary gala beneath chandeliers and applause, Logan Northrop raised his glass and announced that Emily Carter would become the new deputy executive officer, the woman, he said, who had stood beside him while building everything. Emily stepped forward to cheers. Across the room, Logan's wife, Lydia Northrop, stood quietly among the guests. No one mentioned the woman who had written the first proposals, corrected the contracts, stabilized the finances, and quietly protected the company for years. But long before that applause faded, there were already emails, bank records, and recordings waiting documents that would soon tell a very different story. If you believe dignity often speaks more quietly than applause, stay with this story until the end. And before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? If stories about truth, patience, and justice matter to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. Most people who met Lydia Northrop for the first time remembered very little about her, not because she lacked presence, but because she never competed for it. At corporate events, she stood half a step behind the conversation, listening more than speaking. Her voice, when she used it, was measured and precise. She did not interrupt, did not embellish stories, did not reach for attention. To those who barely knew her, she seemed almost too calm for the loud world her husband inhabited. Logan Northrop filled rooms easily. He was tall, confident, and practiced in the art of making people feel included in his vision. When Logan spoke about business, investors leaned forward. When he shook hands, he held eye contact just long enough to suggest sincerity. His confidence was contagious, and over time it had become the central force behind the rise of Northrop Analytics. Most people believed the company existed because Logan believed in it hard enough. That was the story told at conferences. It was the story repeated in interviews. And eventually, it became the story Logan himself remembered. Years earlier, the beginning had looked very different. Back then, the apartment Logan and Lydia shared in Evanston was small enough that the kitchen table doubled as a workspace. Logan had an idea, an ambitious platform that could analyze complex financial data for mid-sized investment firms. The idea was exciting, but ideas alone did not attract investors. They required structure, numbers, language that made risk look manageable. Logan understood the vision. Lydia understood the architecture behind it. She had spent the early years of her career working in risk analysis and compliance. Her job had trained her to see the quiet weaknesses hidden inside, unpromising plans, contracts, regulatory blind spots, liability exposure. She noticed the places where optimism could become expensive. The first business plan for Northrop Analytics had been Logan's. The second version had been Lydia's. She reorganized the projections. She rewrote entire sections that investors would later praise as clear thinking. She adjusted the financial model so the numbers could survive the scrutiny of venture capital analysts. When Logan rehearsed his first pitch deck, Lydia sat across from him with a notebook. "Pause there," she said once, tapping the table lightly. Logan frowned. "Well, you're skipping the cost structure. I'll get to it later." "You can't," she said calmly. "They'll ask about it in the first 5 minutes." Logan leaned back, frustrated. But she was right. They always did. Over the following weeks, their evenings followed the same pattern. Logan spoke through slides while Lydia listened. Sometimes she asked questions that forced him to rethink assumptions. Other times, she simply rewrote a sentence. When the first investor meeting ended successfully, Logan was exhilarated. "They loved it," he said, pacing the apartment with energy. Lydia smiled, though she had expected that outcome long before the meeting began. The company launched slowly. At first, it was only Logan and 2 early engineers working from a shared workspace, Mistress in downtown Chicago. Lydia kept her own job during the day, but spent nights helping Logan solve problems that had no immediate solutions. Investor updates, contract language, financial controls that would keep the company compliant with regulations it barely understood yet. She never appeared in photographs. She never attended the early networking dinners. Those were Logan's domain. He had a natural ability to command a room in ways Lydia never desired to. Logan's reputation grew quickly. Within 2 years, Northrop Analytics secured a major partnership with a regional investment group. The deal was complicated and nearly collapsed during negotiations over liability exposure. Logan remembered arguing passionately for the company's value. He remembered convincing them the product was worth the risk. What he never realized was that Lydia had spent an entire weekend rewriting the legal framework that made the agreement possible. The contract arrived Monday morning. The investors signed it that afternoon. From the outside, the story looked clean. Founder convinces investors. Company grows. The narrative was simple enough to repeat at conferences, and Logan repeated it often. At first, Lydia noticed the omissions. He would say, "When I built the early model," or "when I restructured the deal." Sometimes Lydia would hear the story while standing beside him. She never corrected him. It was not resentment that kept her silent. It was something closer to practicality. Logan needed the story. Founders often did. Investors trusted narratives that were easy to follow. And Lydia had never been interested in the spotlight. Still, habits formed quietly. Years working in compliance had taught Lydia one discipline above all others: documentation. Every proposal she edited, she saved. Every email thread discussing strategy she archived. Not because she expected conflict, but because clarity required records. By the time Northrop Analytics moved into its first real office building in Chicago's West Loop, Lydia had a digital folder structure that traced the company's growth step by step. Drafts of pitch decks, early financial spreadsheets, contracts she had corrected late at night while Logan slept. If someone had looked through those files carefully, they would have seen something unusual. Behind nearly every major milestone stood two voices, Logan's and Lydia's. But only one of them appeared on stage. As the company expanded, Logan's schedule became crowded with speaking invitations, investor panels, and networking events. Lydia attended fewer and fewer of them. At home, she preferred quiet evenings. Logan often joked about it to colleagues. "My wife hates business parties," he would say with a laugh. The truth was simpler. Lydia didn't hate them. She simply saw no reason to compete with the noise. The company now employed more than 80 people. Departments formed. New executives arrived. Logan hired managers who admired his ambition and mirrored his energy. And slowly, the space around him changed. Where once Lydia had been the person he asked for second opinions, now there were consultants, advisors, and senior strategists filling those roles. At first, Lydia noticed the shift only in small ways. Logan stopped asking her to review presentations. He no longer ran contracts by her before signing. Instead, he described decisions after they were already made. "I've got a great strategy team now," he said once while checking messages on his phone. "They're handling the details." Lydia nodded. Details had always been where she lived. But she didn't argue. She observed. When the company reached its 5th anniversary, Logan appeared on a financial technology podcast discussing entrepreneurial leadership. The host asked him a familiar question. What was the hardest part of building Northrop Analytics? Logan leaned back in his chair and smiled. "The early days," he said. "It was just me and a few engineers trying to build something from nothing." Across the room, Lydia heard the interview playing from Logan's laptop speakers. She paused while washing a coffee mug in the sink. The statement wasn't exactly false, but it wasn't entirely true either. She dried her hands slowly and returned to her desk. On her computer screen, a folder remained open. Inside were dozens of files from those early years. Emails, drafts, revisions, quiet evidence of how things had actually unfolded. Lydia closed the folder without hesitation. Records, after all, didn't need attention to exist. They only needed time. And Lydia had always been patient with time. Far more patient than Logan understood. Success rarely arrives with a single moment anyone can point to. For Northrop Analytics, a growth came through a slow accumulation of small victories, Contracts signed quietly, partnerships negotiated patiently, systems that worked well enough to convince investors the company deserved to exist another year. From the outside, the progress looked like momentum driven by Logan Northrop's ambition. Inside the machinery of the company, Lydia Northrop understood that momentum was often more fragile than people believed. In the third year after the company's founding, Northrop Analytics nearly lost its largest client. The problem began with a regulatory concern buried inside a contract clause the client's legal department flagged during a routine audit. The clause wasn't illegal, but it was ambiguous enough that the client's compliance officers hesitated to proceed with a major expansion of their agreement. Logan learned about the issue on a Thursday afternoon. By evening, he was pacing his office, voice tight with frustration, while explaining the situation over the phone to Lydia. "They're overreacting," he said. "It's a minor wording issue." "What exactly did they flag?" Lydia asked. Logan read the clause aloud. Lydia didn't respond immediately. "That language exposes them to liability," she said finally. "It doesn't. It does if their auditors interpret it that way." Logan sighed. "We'll fix it next quarter. You won't have a next quarter with them if it isn't fixed now." There was silence on the line. "What are you suggesting?" Logan asked. "Send me the full contract," Lydia said. By midnight, Lydia had opened a dozen legal references across her laptop. Her background in compliance meant she recognized patterns where most entrepreneurs saw paperwork. Contracts were rarely dangerous because of what they said. They were dangerous because of what they failed to say clearly. The revision Lydia sent Logan at 3 in the morning changed only 2 paragraphs. But those 2 paragraphs redefined liability responsibility between the companies. When Logan forwarded the revised language to the client's legal team the next day, their response came quickly. Approved. The contract expansion proceeded without further discussion. At the office that week, Logan celebrated the deal with his team. He told them the negotiation had been intense. He told them persistence mattered. No one asked about the revised paragraphs. The company moved forward. Lydia returned to her own work. Moments like that repeated themselves over the years. Sometimes the problems were technical, sometimes financial. Once during the company's 4th year, a potential investor nearly withdrew funding after discovering inconsistencies in the startup's projected scaling costs. Logan had built the projections quickly while preparing for a venture capital presentation. The numbers were optimistic. Too optimistic, the investor's analyst noticed. The email arrived late in the evening. Logan forwarded it to Lydia with a short message. "They're questioning the model." "Can you look at it?" Lydia opened the spreadsheet. The formulas weren't wrong, but they assumed growth rates that ignored operational bottlenecks. She recalculated the projections overnight. Her version was less dramatic, but it was believable. The revised spreadsheet included a short explanatory note that outlined risk scenarios investors typically expected responsible founders to acknowledge. Logan used that version the next morning. During the presentation, the investor nodded when Logan described the updated projections. "Good," the investor said. "You've accounted for operational scaling." Logan smiled. The funding round closed 2 weeks later. Stories like these rarely appeared in the public version of the company's history. They were too quiet. Investors preferred narratives about bold founders making decisive moves. Employees liked believing they were part of something powered by vision and courage. Compliance corrections at 3 in the morning didn't fit that image. Lydia understood that. She had never asked for recognition. But as Northrop Analytics expanded, something subtle changed in the way Logan spoke about the company's early days. At first, the shift was almost invisible. When journalists asked how the first investment round succeeded, Logan said things like, "I spent months refining the financial model." Technically true. He had spent months discussing it with Lydia. When conference moderators asked about the legal hurdles startups faced, Logan said, "We navigated the contracts carefully." Also true. But the word "we" gradually disappeared. In later interviews, Logan said simply, "I handled the negotiations personally." Lydia noticed the change without reacting to it. She understood memory had a strange way of reorganizing events over time. The person standing on stage often became the center of the story, even when others had helped build it. Still, Lydia kept her habits. Emails remained archived, drafts remained saved. Every revision she made carried a timestamp. Some nights she reread old threads, not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet curiosity. The early conversations between her and Logan sounded different from the way he now described those years. Back then, Logan had asked questions constantly. "What do you think? Can you check this? Does this clause make sense?" His messages had carried urgency and trust. Over time, the tone changed. As the company grew, Logan hired specialists, financial officers, legal consultants, strategic advisors. The role Lydia once played informally began to disperse among professionals inside the company. Logan seemed relieved by that. He liked the feeling of being surrounded by a team. He liked walking through the office floor and seeing dozens of employees working under the vision he described in presentations. He liked hearing his name mentioned in technology publications. And Lydia noticed something else. With each success, Logan's stories about the company became smoother, cleaner, more heroic. In those stories, the early chaos faded. The sleepless nights disappeared. And the quiet work that had supported those years simply stopped existing. One evening, Lydia sat at her desk reviewing an old investor pitch deck from the company's first year. The file still carried her notes in the margins. Clarify liability language here. Projection unrealistic unless hiring schedule changes. Explain data privacy safeguards. She scrolled slowly through the slides. The final version of the presentation had looked polished enough to impress investors. But the original draft Logan created had been rough, messy, full of ambition, but missing structure. Lydia closed the file and leaned back in her chair. None of that history bothered her. People remembered events differently as time passed. What interested her more was something else. Patterns. Patterns were the language of compliance. Small changes that repeated over time often revealed larger shifts. And recently, Lydia had begun noticing new patterns in Logan's behavior. New names appearing in email threads. New meetings appearing in his calendar. New voices shaping the strategy of the company she had helped build. One name appeared more often than the others. Emily Carter. At first, Lydia saw the name in routine updates from Logan's executive team. Strategy meeting with Emily. Emily preparing market expansion analysis. Lunch discussion with Emily about investor outreach. The frequency increased gradually. Soon, Emily appeared in Logan's conversations almost daily. "She's sharp," Logan said casually one night while scrolling through messages on his phone. "Really understands market positioning." Lydia nodded. Logan spoke about many employees that way. But the patterns continued. Emily began traveling with Logan to conferences. Her name appeared on presentation slides. When Logan mentioned strategy discussions, Emily's perspective was often included. "She's helping rethink our growth model," Logan said once. Lydia listened without comment. She had spent years observing systems, organizations, people. And she knew one quiet truth about power inside companies. Influence rarely arrived loudly. It arrived through proximity, through access, through the simple act of being present when decisions formed. Lydia opened another folder on her computer. Inside were thousands of archived emails stretching back to the company's earliest days. She didn't open any of them. Instead, she created a new folder. The name was simple: Current Records. Inside it, she began saving new communications, travel schedules, expense reports, meeting summaries. Not out of suspicion, not out of anger, but because Lydia Northrop had always believed in one professional principle above all others. If something mattered, it deserved to be documented. And the patterns she was beginning to see around Logan and Emily Carter felt like something that might matter later. Time would decide how much. Lydia had never rushed time. She simply prepared for what it eventually revealed. Emily Carter arrived at Northrop Analytics on a gray Monday morning in early autumn when Chicago's air had begun to carry the first quiet hints of winter. Her resume was impressive. An MBA from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management, 2 years with a respected strategy consulting firm, several published articles about financial technology growth markets. Logan noticed her immediately during the interview process. Emily spoke with the confidence of someone who had studied not only the mechanics of business, but also the psychology of influence. She knew how to mirror enthusiasm. She knew when to complement ideas. She knew how to present analysis in a way that made executives feel smarter for agreeing with her. When she described Northrop Analytics, during the interview she used language Logan liked hearing. "Your company has a rare opportunity," Emily said, sitting across the conference table with her hands folded neatly. "You're positioned between data infrastructure and predictive analytics. If the growth strategy is executed correctly, this could become a category leader." Logan leaned forward slightly. "What would you do differently?" he asked. Emily smiled. "Scale faster," she said. That answer stayed with him. Within a week, Emily Carter joined the company as a strategy consultant. Her office was 2 doors down from Logan's. At first, her role appeared straightforward. She analyzed market trends, prepared expansion reports, and attended occasional executive meetings to present her findings. But Emily possessed an instinct that went beyond analysis. She understood visibility. During meetings, she listened carefully while others spoke, then summarized discussions with calm clarity that made her contributions feel essential. When Logan asked for opinions, Emily framed her responses as extensions of his own thinking. "I think your instinct about expanding into regional banks is exactly right," she said during one meeting. "The data shows the timing is perfect." The room nodded. Logan appreciated people who recognized his instincts. Emily quickly became someone he trusted in discussions about growth strategy. Within months, she began traveling with Logan to industry conferences. At first, the trips were purely professional. Northrop Analytics needed representation at financial technology events across the country, and Emily's ability to speak confidently about market expansion made her a useful addition. In Boston, she delivered a presentation about predictive analytics trends. In Austin, she moderated a panel discussion about fintech infrastructure. Each time Logan watched her navigate conversations with investors and executives, he felt the same quiet satisfaction. Emily made the company look sophisticated, ambitious, forward-thinking. And Emily understood something else as well. Logan enjoyed admiration. Not exaggerated praise, but recognition. She learned to phrase her suggestions carefully. When discussing strategy documents, she often said things like, "Your earlier presentation hinted at this direction," or "Your framework from last quarter fits perfectly with this approach." Logan rarely questioned those connections. To him, they sounded logical. Inside the company, employees began noticing Emily's growing presence. Her name appeared on meeting schedules more frequently. Her analysis reports circulated among senior staff. When executives gathered in Logan's office to discuss upcoming partnerships, Emily often sat beside him, flipping through documents and offering observations that guided the conversation. Meanwhile, Lydia observed the changes from a distance. She did not work inside the Northrop Analytics office regularly, but she remained close enough to the company's operations to notice subtle shifts. The first pattern appeared in Logan's travel schedule. In the past, Logan often attended conferences alone or with rotating members of the executive team. Now, Emily's name appeared consistently beside his in travel confirmations. Boston, San Francisco, Denver. Logan mentioned the trips casually during dinner conversations. "Emily handled the investor dinner perfectly," he said one evening while pouring a glass of wine. "She's very sharp." Lydia nodded. "She sounds capable," she said. Logan continued describing the conference. Emily's insights, Emily's networking skills, Emily's ability to keep conversations moving. Lydia listened quietly. She had heard Logan speak enthusiastically about colleagues before. Excitement about talented employees wasn't unusual for him. Still, patterns mattered. Over the following months, Emily's influence within the company expanded steadily. She gained access to internal strategy documents. Logan asked her to review presentations before major investor meetings. During executive discussions, Emily sometimes answered questions before other department heads could respond. The changes were subtle enough that no one openly challenged them. But Lydia noticed something else. Certain ideas Logan presented publicly began sounding familiar. Not because Lydia had heard Emily say them, but because Lydia herself had once suggested similar strategies during earlier years. Regional banking expansion, data partnerships with mid-sized funds, incremental scaling rather than aggressive market capture. Ideas that Logan had once debated with Lydia during long evenings at their kitchen table now appeared in polished strategy documents presented by Emily. The repetition didn't anger Lydia. Instead, it confirmed something she already understood. Influence inside organizations often moved through channels invisible to most people. The person presenting an idea was not always the person who had shaped it first. One afternoon, Lydia opened a folder containing old emails between her and Logan from the company's early period. She read one message from 5 years earlier. "We should consider regional banks first. Less competition, easier compliance structure." The message had been sent by Lydia. Logan's reply followed minutes later. "Interesting. Let me think about that." Now that same strategy appeared inside a document Emily prepared for Logan's executive team. Lydia closed the email thread without comment. She did not interpret the repetition as theft. Ideas often resurfaced through different voices. What mattered to Lydia was the structure forming around Logan. Emily's role was no longer limited to analysis. She now controlled parts of Logan's daily schedule. Her calendar invitations organized executive meetings. Her summaries circulated after discussions. She became the person employees contacted when they needed time with the CEO. Proximity, access, influence. The progression was logical. Lydia began documenting small operational details. Travel reimbursements, expense reports attached to conference trips, calendar changes that affected executive meetings. Not because she believed anything improper was happening, but because Lydia Northrop had spent years working in compliance environments where documentation was routine. People often misunderstood documentation. They assumed it meant suspicion. For Lydia, it meant preparation. Evidence clarified truth. And truth in professional environments depended on records more than opinions. Meanwhile, Emily continued strengthening her position. She learned the preferences of Logan's most important investors. She memorized the talking points Logan used during presentations. When reporters asked questions about Northrop Analytics' future, Emily sometimes stood nearby, ready to supply supporting details. Employees inside the company began referring to her as Logan's right hand. The phrase appeared casually at first, then more often. During one internal strategy meeting, Victor Langley, one of the company's board members, glanced toward Emily while reviewing a report. "Emily, you've been working closely with Logan," Victor said. "What's your assessment of the expansion timeline?" Emily answered calmly. "I think Logan's instinct about accelerating the rollout is correct," she said. "The data supports moving sooner rather than later." Victor nodded. Logan smiled slightly. Across town, Lydia sat in her quiet home office reviewing another set of company documents. Outside the window, Chicago's skyline reflected the fading afternoon light. Her computer screen displayed a collection of travel invoices submitted through the company's expense system, conference registrations, hotel bookings, flight confirmations. Most of them looked routine. But Lydia had learned long ago that routine data sometimes revealed subtle stories when viewed over time. She created another subfolder inside her records, travel records. Then she saved copies of the documents, not because she expected to find wrongdoing, but because patterns, once they formed clearly enough, often told their own story. and Lydia had begun to sense that a new story was quietly forming around Logan Northrop and Emily Carter. She did not rush to interpret it. She simply continued observing, carefully, patiently, the way she always had. Influence inside a growing company rarely shifts all at once. It moves gradually, carried by small decisions that seem harmless on their own. At Northrop Analytics, the change began with meetings. For years, Logan Northrop had run executive meetings with a kind of improvisational energy. Department heads gathered around the glass conference table while Logan sketched ideas across the whiteboard. Discussions were often chaotic but productive. Lydia remembered those meetings from the early years. Logan would return home late in the evening, energized by arguments about product features, pricing models, or investor expectations. Sometimes he called Lydia afterward to talk through the decisions. "What do you think about the risk exposure here?" he would ask. Those conversations had once been routine. Now they rarely happened. Inside the company, the structure of meetings had changed. Emily Carter introduced a system of organized agendas and post-meeting summaries. Each executive discussion followed a structured outline. Action points were documented. Follow-up tasks were assigned. Employees appreciated the clarity. Logan appreciated the efficiency. Emily's summaries circulated through internal email threads after each meeting. Her writing was crisp and confident, presenting decisions in language that made the strategy appear unified and deliberate. Gradually, the flow of communication inside the company began passing through her. If a department needed approval from Logan, they often contacted Emily first. If Logan needed analysis for a presentation, Emily coordinated the material. The arrangement seemed natural. Every successful executive eventually relied on someone to manage the complexity surrounding them. Emily simply filled that role well. One Wednesday afternoon, Logan's senior team gathered for a quarterly strategy meeting. The room overlooked Chicago's West Loop, where new office buildings had risen quickly over the past decade. The view reminded employees that Northrop Analytics had grown alongside the city's expanding technology sector. Victor Langley, one of the board members, joined the meeting remotely through a large screen mounted on the wall. Logan stood at the front of the room beside a presentation slide outlining potential expansion into regional financial institutions. "We've talked about this direction before," Logan said. "Mid-sized banks need data analytics tools, but can't afford enterprise systems. There's a gap in the market." Emily sat near the center of the table, reviewing printed documents. "Exactly," she said calmly. "The opportunity aligns perfectly with the model Logan described last quarter." Several executives nodded. The slide changed, revealing a detailed rollout timeline. Emily continued, "If we prioritize regional markets first, the regulatory framework is simpler. That reduces risk during the early stages of expansion." Logan glanced toward her briefly. "That's right," he said. "Lower compliance barriers." The strategy moved forward without resistance. Later that evening, Logan returned home energized by the meeting. He spoke quickly while loosening his tie in the kitchen. "We're finally moving on the regional bank strategy," he said. "It's the right move." Lydia looked up from the book she had been reading. "That sounds promising," she said. Logan opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of sparkling water. "Emily put together a great analysis for it," he added. "Very thorough." Lydia nodded. Years earlier, she had suggested the same direction during discussions about market growth. But the memory didn't trouble her. Ideas traveled. What interested her more was the structure forming around those ideas. After Logan went upstairs to answer emails, Lydia returned to her desk. Her computer displayed the same quiet folder system she had maintained for years. She opened the file labeled Current Records. Inside were documents she had collected during the past several months. Expense reports, travel confirmations, meeting summaries circulated by Emily. Most of them were ordinary. Still, Lydia believed ordinary records deserved careful attention. She opened one travel invoice from a conference Logan had attended in Denver 3 weeks earlier. The hotel charge listed 2 rooms reserved under the company account. That was normal. Executives often traveled with colleagues. Lydia compared the invoice with Logan's calendar entry from that week. The calendar included a strategy presentation delivered by Logan and Emily Carter. Again, nothing unusual. But Lydia saved the documents anyway. Then she opened another record. This one came from a conference in San Francisco earlier that month. Flight confirmations, hotel bookings, restaurant reimbursements. The expenses appeared legitimate. Yet Lydia noticed a small pattern repeating across several trips. Certain dinners billed to the corporate card were labeled simply as client meeting, but the expense reports did not include the names of any clients. In compliance environments, incomplete documentation often raised questions, not accusations, questions. Lydia created another subfolder inside travel records. She labeled it Pending Clarification. Then she moved copies of the relevant invoices into that folder. Across the city inside the office building where Northrop Analytics operated, Emily Carter was finishing her own workday. Her office light remained on, while most employees had already left. Emily leaned back in her chair, reviewing a draft of Logan's upcoming keynote speech for a fintech conference. The speech outlined the company's future vision: data integration, predictive analytics, expansion into mid-sized banking markets. Emily made small adjustments to the language. She added phrases that highlighted Logan's leadership. She removed sentences that sounded uncertain. When Logan read the revised version the next morning, he would feel confident delivering it. Emily understood how narratives worked. Executives needed stories that made success appear inevitable. The more clearly the story was told, the more others believed in it. Meanwhile, Lydia continued her quiet work at home. She opened a spreadsheet listing corporate expenses associated with executive travel over the past year. The data had been exported from the company's financial reporting system. She sorted the entries by date, then by location, then by the names attached to each reimbursement. Patterns appeared slowly. Certain conferences repeated. Certain hotel chains appeared regularly. Emily Carter's name appeared beside Logan's in nearly every travel entry during the past 6 months. Again, the pattern was not inherently suspicious. Senior strategists often traveled with CEOs. But Lydia believed patterns deserved context. She opened another document, a summary report Emily had circulated after a strategy meeting earlier that week. The report listed action items assigned to various departments. Near the bottom of the document, Lydia noticed a small administrative change. Emily had been granted approval authority over several discretionary marketing budgets. That meant expense approvals would now pass through her. Lydia leaned back in her chair and studied the report. Power inside organizations rarely announced itself. It accumulated quietly through permissions: calendar control, budget authority, access to information. Emily Carter now possessed all 3. Lydia closed the document and added it to her records. She did not interpret the changes as wrongdoing. Corporate structures evolved. People moved into positions of influence. But Lydia also understood something from her years in compliance work. When authority expanded quickly, oversight needed to expand as well. She checked the time. Nearly midnight. Upstairs, Logan was still awake, speaking on the phone in his office. His voice carried faintly through the hallway as he discussed upcoming investor meetings. Lydia listened briefly, not to the words, but to the tone. Logan sounded confident, relaxed, certain that the company was moving in the right direction. Perhaps it was. Lydia hoped it was. Northrop Analytics had been built with too much effort to collapse under careless decisions. She saved the final document of the evening and closed her laptop. The room returned to silence. In the darkness of the screen, Lydia saw her reflection for a moment. Calm, unhurried. She had spent years working with records and patterns. She knew that most systems eventually revealed their truth. The only requirement was patience, and Lydia Northrop had always been patient. The invitation arrived, printed on thick, cream-colored paper, the kind companies used when they wanted success to feel permanent. Northrop Analytics. 7th Anniversary Celebration. The Drake Hotel, Chicago. Lydia Northrop read the card, once then placed it back on the kitchen counter beside Logan's car keys. Company celebrations had grown larger each year. What began as modest gatherings for employees had gradually transformed into polished corporate events, investors, board members, strategic partners, journalists. Logan had learned that public confidence was as valuable to a growing company as its financial reports. Confidence was easier to project in elegant rooms. The Drake Hotel's grand ballroom glowed under crystal chandeliers the night of the event. Waiters moved between tables carrying silver trays of wine glasses, while quiet jazz music filled the space between conversations. Executives from partner firms stood near the bar discussing market forecasts. Venture investors greeted Logan with warm familiarity. Several employees from Northrop Analytics arrived in small groups, their excitement visible in the way they glanced around the room. For many of them, the company's success felt personal. They had joined a startup. Now they worked for a firm that appeared regularly in financial technology publications. At the center of the room, Logan Northrop moved easily through the crowd. He shook hands with investors. He greeted board members with practiced warmth. His confidence had matured over the years. The early uncertainty that once followed him into meetings had been replaced by something steadier. Success had a way of reinforcing itself. Emily Carter stood nearby, speaking with Sandra Whitmore, veteran venture partner, who had invested in the company's Series B funding round 2 years earlier. Emily's black dress was simple but precise, chosen with the same careful attention she applied to strategy presentations. She listened attentively while Sandra described new developments in the fintech investment landscape. "You've helped Logan position the company well," Sandra said. "The expansion into regional banks was smart timing." Emily smiled politely. "Logan had the instinct early," she said. "My role has just been helping organize the strategy." Sandra nodded. Across the room, Lydia entered quietly. She wore a dark blue dress that matched the restrained elegance she preferred. Few people noticed her arrival immediately, but several employees who had worked with Logan in the company's early years greeted her warmly. "Mrs. Northrop," one engineer said with a smile. "It's good to see you." "Good to see you too," Lydia replied. She moved through the room, calmly exchanging brief conversations with people she recognized. Many of them remembered her from the company's earliest days. Others knew her only as Logan's wife. The evening unfolded smoothly. Dinner was served. Investors discussed future funding opportunities. Employees shared stories about the company's rapid growth. Shortly after dessert, a member of the event staff stepped toward the stage to adjust the microphone. The jazz music faded. Logan stood near the front of the room, finishing a conversation with Victor Langley. Victor, a board member with a reputation for careful financial oversight, glanced toward the stage. "Looks like your speech is coming up," he said. Logan smiled. "Just a few words," he replied. He stepped onto the stage as the room quieted. The lights focused gently on the podium. Logan rested his hands against the sides of the lectern and looked out across the ballroom. Moments like this had once made him nervous. Now they felt natural. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began. Applause moved briefly through the room. "When we started Northrop Analytics, the goal was simple: build tools that made financial data easier to understand. At the time, we had a small team and a lot of questions about whether the idea could survive in a competitive market." A few early employees laughed softly. Logan smiled. "But year by year, thanks to the incredible people in this room, we've grown into something much stronger than we imagined." He paused while applause returned. Logan had learned how to pace speeches. Recognition mattered. Investors appreciated hearing their contributions acknowledged. Employees liked knowing their work was visible. Logan thanked several departments individually: engineering, product development, the sales team that had expanded the company's client base. Then his voice shifted slightly. There's someone else I want to recognize tonight." Emily Carter, standing near the front of the stage, looked up. Logan continued. "Over the past year, our company has taken some important steps. Forward new markets, new partnerships, a stronger strategic direction." He glanced toward Emily, and much of that progress wouldn't have happened without the work of one person who has been standing beside me through many of those decisions. The room followed his gaze. Emily stepped forward, slightly uncertain, but smiling. Logan's tone carried pride. "Emily Carter joined Northrop Analytics as a strategist," he said. "But very quickly, she became something more, someone who helped shape the future of this company." A few people began clapping. Logan raised a hand gently. "So tonight, I'm proud to announce that Emily will be stepping into a new role." The room quieted again. "Beginning next quarter, Emily Carter will serve as our Deputy Executive Officer." The applause came immediately. Employees stood. Investors nodded approvingly. Victor Langley clapped with measured approval beside Sandra Whitmore. Emily stepped onto the stage, her expression composed, but visibly surprised. Logan handed her the microphone. "You've earned this," he said quietly. Emily laughed softly, shaking her head. "Thank you," she said to the audience. "I didn't expect this tonight." More applause followed. Across the ballroom, Lydia watched. Her expression did not change. She listened as Emily spoke about teamwork opportunity and the company's future. Emily thanked Logan for his leadership. She thanked the employees for their support. The speech was brief and well delivered. When it ended, Logan stepped forward again and placed a hand lightly on Emily's shoulder while the room applauded. Photographers captured the moment. Two executives standing near Lydia exchanged quiet comments. "Good move," one said. "Emily's been running half the strategy meetings already." The other nodded. "Logan trusts her." Lydia heard the words but did not react. Applause faded. Music returned softly as the formal announcement concluded. Guests resumed conversations. Wine glasses were refilled. Near the stage, Logan and Emily spoke with investors who wanted to congratulate them. Several employees approached Lydia. "Mrs. Northrop?" "What did you think?" one marketing manager asked politely. Lydia smiled. "It was a well-organized event," she said. Her answer was calm, neutral. The manager nodded and returned to the crowd. Lydia glanced once more toward the stage. Logan was laughing with Victor Langley, while Emily spoke with Sandra Whitmore. They looked confident, celebrated. For most people in the room, the evening marked another milestone in the company's success. Lydia turned toward the exit. No one stopped her as she walked quietly through the hallway leading away from the ballroom. Outside, Chicago's night air felt cool and steady. The city moved normally, cars passing streetlights, reflecting on wet pavement from an earlier rain. Inside the ballroom, applause and music continued. Lydia paused beside the hotel entrance for a moment. Then she stepped toward the waiting line of taxis. The driver opened the door as she approached. "Where to?" he asked. "Home," Lydia said gently. The car pulled away from the hotel. Behind her, the celebration continued. But the moment Logan had created on stage had done something else as well. It had drawn a clear line, a public one. And Lydia Northrop understood something about public moments. Once they existed, they could not be undone. The morning after the anniversary, Gala arrived quietly. Chicago's sky was pale with early winter light, and the city outside Lydia Northrop's window moved with its usual rhythm, commuters' distant traffic, the low hum of trains traveling along elevated tracks. Inside Lydia's home office, the silence felt deliberate. Her desk was arranged the way it always was, laptop centered, notebook closed beside it, a cup of coffee cooling slowly near the edge of the table. Lydia sat down and opened her computer. She did not begin with emotion. She began with the structure. The public announcement at the Drake Hotel had changed something important not inside the company's strategy, but inside the visibility of Logan's choices. Before the gala, Emily Carter's influence had grown quietly. After the gala, that influence had been formalized in front of investors, employees, and the board. Titles mattered. Authority created responsibility. Responsibility created accountability. Lydia opened the folder labeled Travel Records. Inside it were the documents she had been collecting during the past several months. Most of them were routine. Corporate travel expenses rarely contained surprises. Still, Lydia believed records deserved context. She began with the Denver conference from earlier that autumn. The expense file listed airfare for Logan and Emily along with hotel reservations charged to the company's executive travel account. 2 rooms had been reserved at the same hotel. That was expected. Senior executives often travel together. But Lydia opened the detailed invoice attached to the hotel confirmation. The document listed check-in times, check-out times, and payment authorizations. Room 1412, room 1413, adjacent rooms. Again, not unusual. But Lydia moved the file into the pending clarification folder. Not because it was improper, because it was incomplete. Next, she opened the San Francisco conference expenses. The pattern repeated. 2 executive reservations, 2 flight confirmations, 2 hotel rooms. But this time, Lydia noticed something different. The restaurant receipts attached to the expense report listed dinners labeled client meeting. No client names were recorded. That detail alone meant very little. Expense reports were often submitted quickly after travel, and documentation sometimes remained vague. But Lydia opened Logan's calendar for the same dates. The conference schedule appeared clearly. Panel discussion, investor meeting, product demonstration. None of the entries referenced client dinners. Lydia made a small note in her notebook. San Francisco, verify client attendance. She continued working. Hours passed quietly while Lydia compared travel records, meeting schedules, and reimbursement documentation. One conference in Boston included several dinners billed under corporate expenses. Another trip to Austin listed transportation costs that appeared higher than usual. None of the records proved misconduct. But patterns formed slowly. Repeated dinners with no documented clients, travel schedules overlapping with unusually long gaps between official meetings. Expense approvals signed electronically under Emily Carter's authorization. Emily's new authority over discretionary budgets meant those approvals passed through her office. Lydia leaned back in her chair. In compliance work, patterns rarely spoke loudly. They whispered through repetition. She saved copies of the relevant records and organized them chronologically. Then she opened a different set of documents, corporate credit card statements tied to the executive travel account. The statements included hundreds of entries: hotels, flights, transportation, restaurants. Most expenses matched the reimbursement reports already filed. But Lydia noticed several charges appearing outside the conference schedules: late evening restaurant bills, private transportation services, occasional purchases made hours after official events had ended. None of the amounts were extreme. None of them would alarm a casual auditor. But Lydia understood how corporate compliance worked. Misuse of funds often appeared not as dramatic theft, but as small expenses disguised inside legitimate travel. She added another note: cross-reference late-night expenses with meeting records. By mid-afternoon, Lydia's desk was covered with organized stacks of printed documents. She did not rush. Each file was reviewed carefully, each date compared, each entry saved. Finally, she opened a blank email window. But she did not type immediately. Instead, she searched for a contact she had not spoken to in several years: David Klein. David had once worked as a corporate compliance attorney for a financial services firm Lydia consulted for early in her career. They had met during a regulatory audit nearly a decade earlier. David was methodical, calm, the kind of lawyer who understood that corporate conflicts often unfolded slowly before reaching the point where legal intervention became necessary. Lydia composed a brief message. Subject: request for professional consultation. Hello, David. It has been some time since we last worked together. I hope you have been well. I am currently reviewing a series of corporate expense and travel records connected to Northrop Analytics. At this stage, I am not alleging wrongdoing, but there are several patterns I would appreciate a compliance perspective on. Would you be available for a short consultation sometime this week? Best regards, Lydia Northrop. She reread the message once. Clear, neutral, professional. Then she sent it. Across the city, inside the glass-walled office of Northrop Analytics, the workday moved forward normally. Logan Northrop stood in a conference room with several department heads discussing the next quarter's expansion plans. Emily Carter sat beside him, reviewing a presentation on her tablet. The mood in the room was optimistic. The announcement at the gala had energized the leadership team. Emily's new title gave her formal authority to coordinate strategy across departments. Logan appreciated how smoothly she handled those responsibilities. "She's organized," he told Victor Langley earlier that morning during a call with a board member. Victor had responded with cautious approval. "Structure is good," Victor said, "but keep oversight tight. Growth can create blind spots." Logan assured him everything remained under control. He believed it. Northrop Analytics had grown steadily for 7 years. The company's financial reports were strong. Investors were satisfied. Nothing about the current strategy suggested instability. Inside the meeting room, Emily pointed to a chart on the presentation screen. "If we expand into the Midwest Regional Bank Network first," she said, "the regulatory hurdles remain manageable. We can scale gradually without overwhelming our infrastructure." Logan nodded. "That's the approach," he said. The executives around the table agreed. Outside the office building, Lydia finished organizing the final stack of documents on her desk. Her laptop chimed softly. A reply from David Klein appeared in her inbox. Subject: Re-request for professional consultation. "Hello, Lydia. It's good to hear from you. I'd be happy to review the material you're referencing. Patterns in expense documentation often deserve careful attention. Are you available tomorrow afternoon?" "Best, David," Lydia replied with a simple confirmation. Then she closed her laptop. The room returned to quiet. She did not feel anger or urgency, only clarity. For years, Lydia Northrop had worked inside systems where truth depended on records rather than assumptions. The documents on her desk were not conclusions. They were beginnings. And beginnings, Lydia knew, often mattered more than people realized. The office of David Klein sat on the 22nd floor of a modest building in downtown Chicago, far from the polished glass towers where venture capital firms preferred to establish their headquarters. The building was older, quieter. It housed accountants, small law practices, and consulting firms that specialized in the less glamorous aspects of corporate life: compliance, regulatory defense, financial oversight. The kind of work that rarely appeared in press releases but determined whether companies survived scrutiny. Lydia Northrop arrived 5 minutes early. David Klein greeted her in the reception area with a polite smile and the careful attentiveness Lydia remembered from years earlier. "Lydia," he said, shaking her hand. "It's been a while," it has, she replied. His office was orderly in the way only lawyers who respected documentation tended to keep their spaces. Shelves held rows of labeled binders, and the desk carried only a laptop, a legal pad, and 2 neatly stacked case files. David gestured toward a chair. "So," he said calmly, "tell me what you're seeing." Lydia placed a folder on the desk and opened it. Inside were copies of the travel records, expense reports, and credit card statements she had been organizing over the past several days. "These documents come from executive travel accounts connected to Northrop Analytics," she said. "Most of the entries are routine: conferences, investor meetings, industry events." David skimmed the top page. And the concern, Lydia spoke evenly. Certain expenses appear repeatedly without proper documentation. Dinners labeled as client meetings with no client listed. Travel charges outside scheduled events. Expense approvals authorized internally. David leaned back slightly in his chair. How long has this pattern been occurring? Approximately 6 months, Lydia said. He studied the documents more carefully. Are you suggesting misuse of corporate funds? I'm suggesting incomplete records, Lydia replied. David nodded. That's a useful distinction. He picked up one of the San Francisco receipts Lydia had flagged. A dinner charged as a client meeting, he said, reading the line item. But no client name. Yes, David placed the receipt down. In most companies, that alone wouldn't trigger immediate concern. Documentation errors happen, I understand, Lydia said. David turned another page, but patterns changed the conversation. Lydia nodded slightly. That's why I brought them. For the next 40 minutes, they reviewed the documents methodically. David asked questions about corporate structure, board oversight, expense approval procedures, Emily Carter's newly granted authority over discretionary budgets. When they finished, David closed the folder and rested his hands together thoughtfully. At this stage, he said, you don't have proof of misconduct. That's correct. What you have, he continued, is a pattern of expenses that may require explanation. Lydia waited. David leaned forward slightly. If this situation escalates into a corporate governance issue, documentation will matter. Records showing how expenses were categorized, who approved them, and whether they served legitimate business purposes. That's why I've organized everything chronologically, Lydia said. David gave a small, approving nod. Good. He paused before speaking again. One more question. Yes. Why are you reviewing these records personally instead of bringing them directly to the company's compliance department? Lydia answered calmly. I wanted to understand the pattern before involving anyone else. David studied her for a moment. He understood there was more behind the situation than simple accounting concerns. But Lydia did not elaborate, and he did not press. Instead, he said, continue documenting everything. Do not confront anyone directly. If the pattern continues, we may need to consider formal disclosure channels. Lydia gathered the documents. Thank you, David. Keep me informed, he said. When Lydia left the building, the afternoon light had softened across the Chicago skyline. Traffic moved slowly along the streets below. People hurried between offices carrying briefcases and coffee cups. Life continued normally. Inside Northrop Analytics, however, Logan Northrop believed the company was entering one of its strongest periods of growth. The leadership team had embraced Emily Carter's strategic structure enthusiastically. Departments communicated more efficiently. Expansion plans moved forward. Investors responded positively to Logan's recent keynote speech. That afternoon, Logan sat in his office reviewing a market analysis Emily had prepared. The document outlined projected revenue growth if the company successfully expanded its data analytics platform to regional banking networks across the Midwest. Emily stood beside the desk, explaining several points. If we secure partnerships with 3 regional banking groups before the end of next quarter, she said, pointing to the chart, the market perception alone will increase our valuation significantly. Logan studied the numbers. This is aggressive, he said. Emily smiled. Growth always is. Logan leaned back in his chair. He appreciated Emily's confidence. Where other executives hesitated over uncertainty, Emily seemed comfortable with risk. That confidence energized him. Let's present this to the board next month, Logan said. I'll prepare the materials, Emily replied. Across the city, Lydia returned home and opened her laptop again. Her meeting with David Klein had clarified something important. The documents she had collected were not accusations. They were simply records waiting to be understood. She opened the folder labeled Current Records and added notes from the meeting. Then she created another folder, Historical Contracts. Inside it, she began reviewing documents from earlier years of Northrop Analytics' development. Not because they related directly to the travel expenses, but because Lydia understood context mattered. Corporate conflicts rarely emerged from a single issue. They grew from layers of decisions made over time. While reviewing the files, Lydia paused on a contract dated nearly 4 years earlier. It involved a partnership agreement with a financial investment group called us Westbridge Capital. The negotiation had nearly collapsed during final review. Westbridge's legal team had raised concerns about data liability and regulatory exposure. Logan had been furious at the time. They're overcomplicating everything he said during a phone call with Lydia late that night. But Lydia had spent the entire weekend rewriting the contract language to address the concerns. She remembered the moment clearly. The revised document clarified data protection responsibilities and regulatory compliance obligations between the two companies. Westbridge signed the contract on Monday morning. That partnership later became one of Northrop Analytics' most profitable agreements. Logan rarely mentioned the details of that negotiation when describing the company's history. He simply said he had convinced the investors to trust the product. Lydia did not resent the omission, but the memory reminded her of something. Many of the company's most important turning points had happened quietly, behind the scenes, through careful documentation and patient revision. She closed the contract file. The work she was doing now felt similar. Not dramatic, not emotional, just careful attention to records. Outside her office window, evening lights began appearing across the city skyline. Inside the quiet room, Lydia saved the final document for the day. Her evidence file had grown larger, not because she was searching for wrongdoing, but because she believed systems deserved transparency. And transparency, in the end, depended on records. Logan Northrop did not yet know how many records already existed. But Lydia Northrop understood something about time. Truth rarely arrived suddenly. It assembled itself piece by piece. And she had already begun assembling it. By early December, Chicago's mornings arrived in muted shades of gray. Frost edged the windows of Lydia Northrop's home office, while the city outside moved slowly through the cold. The quiet suited her. Winter had always sharpened her focus, as if the stillness of the season encouraged careful thought. On her desk, Lydia had arranged the evidence she had been collecting for weeks into several clearly labeled folders: travel records, expense statements, calendar comparisons, pending clarifications. The organization itself was nothing dramatic. It was simply the method Lydia had practiced for most of her professional life. When questions emerged, documentation created clarity. But now, another layer had begun to form: access logs. The idea had come to Lydia after reviewing one of Emily Carter's conference summaries that mentioned a late strategy meeting held in the Northrop Analytics building after normal office hours. The building used a digital keycard system. Every entry and exit passed through a log maintained by building security. Lydia did not obtain the records illegally. She requested them through a legitimate administrative contact who still remembered her from the company's early years. The request was framed neutrally, an internal review of executive access activity tied to travel scheduling. No one questioned it. Within 2 days, Lydia received the data. Thousands of timestamps, employee names, door access points. She opened the spreadsheet and began sorting the entries. Most of them were exactly what one would expect in a growing company. Employees entering early, engineers leaving late, cleaning staff moving between floors after midnight. But Lydia filtered the records by 2 names: Logan Northrop, Emily Carter. The result narrowed the data to several dozen entries. Most of them were normal morning arrivals, evening departures after meetings. But several dates stood out. 3 separate nights during the past 2 months showed both Logan and Emily accessing the executive floor long after the rest of the staff had left. 10:42 p.m., 11:17 p.m., 12:03 a.m. Late meetings were not impossible. Executives often worked unpredictable hours. Still, Lydia cross-referenced the dates with the company's meeting calendar. No executive sessions were scheduled on those nights. She wrote another note in her notebook: late access verify meeting records. Next, she opened a separate file. During one of Logan's recent conferences in Austin, the event organizers had recorded all keynote presentations and panel discussions. The recordings were later uploaded to a private industry archive. Lydia found the video from Logan's keynote address. She watched the recording carefully. Logan spoke confidently about Northrop Analytics' future. Predictive data systems, regional banking partnerships, a new leadership structure designed to guide expansion. At one point in the speech, he gestured towards someone seated near the front of the audience. "Emily Carter, our strategy director," he said proudly. "She's been instrumental in shaping the direction we're taking." The camera shifted briefly toward Emily. She smiled politely as the audience applauded. Nothing about the moment appeared unusual. But Lydia was not watching the speech for appearances. She was watching it for timing. After the keynote ended, the recording continued for several minutes. While attendees mingled in the conference hall, Logan stepped down from the stage. Emily joined him. They spoke briefly before walking toward a side hallway outside the camera's main frame. Lydia paused the video. Then she opened Logan's travel schedule from the same conference. According to the official itinerary, Logan's next scheduled meeting had occurred nearly 2 hours later. 2 hours of unaccounted time. That detail alone meant nothing. Conferences often created gaps between sessions. Still, Lydia saved the timestamp. She added the video file to a new folder, conference footage. Then she returned to the building access logs. Patterns continued to form. On one of the nights where Logan and Emily accessed the executive floor after midnight, security cameras in the lobby would likely have recorded their arrival and departure. Lydia did not request the footage immediately. That step would require more formal justification. Instead, she documented the access records carefully. Every timestamp, every entry, every exit. By the time the winter sun had climbed halfway across the sky, Lydia's evidence file had grown into something more structured than a collection of documents. It had become a timeline. Dates connected to travel, expenses connected to locations, access logs connected to late-night activity inside the company office. She printed the timeline and placed it on her desk. Looking at it, Lydia felt neither anger nor satisfaction, only recognition. The patterns she had sensed months earlier were no longer abstract. They were measurable. Across the city, Logan Northrop was preparing for a board strategy call, scheduled later that afternoon. He stood in the conference room reviewing financial projections, while Emily adjusted the slides on the presentation screen. Victor Langley would join the call along with 2 other board members. Logan felt confident about the numbers. The company's revenue had grown steadily throughout the year. The new expansion plan promised even greater growth if executed properly. Emily glanced at him. "Ready?" she asked. Logan nodded. "Let's do it." The meeting began promptly at 2 o'clock. Victor Langley's voice filled the conference room through the video screen. "Good afternoon, Logan." "Afternoon," Victor Logan replied. Emily presented the first part of the strategy update. Her tone remained calm and precise while she walked the board through projected market expansion. Victor listened carefully. "So you're confident the regional banking model will scale?" he asked. "Yes," Emily said. "The regulatory barriers are manageable." Logan supported the explanation. "We've done the groundwork," he said. "This is the next logical step." Victor nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "But as we grow, oversight becomes more important." Logan smiled. "We've got that covered." Across the city, Lydia finished reviewing the final entry in the access log spreadsheet. She closed the file and leaned back in her chair. The room was quiet again. The documents on her desk did not accuse anyone. They did not interpret motives. They simply described events, dates, times, locations, patterns. Lydia gathered the papers and placed them neatly into a new binder. On the front, she wrote a single label, chronological file. Then, she opened her email, Lydia, and drafted a short message to David Klein. Subject, additional records. Hello, David. I have organized several new documents related to the expense and access patterns we discussed earlier. These include building access logs and publicly available conference recordings. No conclusions yet, but the timeline is becoming clearer. I'll send the full file for your review this week. Best regards, Lydia. She sent the message and closed the laptop. Outside the window, evening light had begun to fade across Chicago's skyline. Inside the office building downtown, Logan Northrop finished the board meeting, feeling satisfied. The strategy had been approved. The company's future looked strong. He walked down the hallway beside Emily, discussing plans for the next investor presentation. Neither of them realized that a timeline already existed, one built quietly through records. And timelines Lydia knew well had a way of revealing truths people believed would remain unnoticed. Winter settled fully over Chicago by the time Lydia Northrop met David Klein again. The city's streets were dusted with a thin layer of snow, and the lake wind moved through the downtown buildings with a quiet persistence that locals learned to ignore. Inside David's office, the heat hummed softly while Lydia placed a thick binder on the desk between them. David raised his eyebrows slightly. "You've been busy," he said. Lydia opened the binder. Inside were the documents she had organized over the past several weeks. Each section was separated by labeled tabs: travel expenses, credit card statements, conference footage, building access logs, chronological timeline. David turned the pages slowly, reading with the concentration of someone trained to look for inconsistencies. "Let's start from the beginning," he said. Lydia nodded. "For the past 6 months," she said calmly, "corporate expense reports tied to executive travel have included several undocumented charges. Dinners listed as client meetings with no clients identified. Transportation charges outside scheduled events." David nodded slightly. "That alone would be considered sloppy documentation," he said. "Yes, but patterns matter," he continued. Lydia pointed to a page in the binder. "This timeline cross-references the expense entries with Logan's travel schedule." David followed the columns carefully. Several entries aligned with conference appearances. Others appeared hours after official events had ended. Then he reached the section containing building access logs. "These are from the Northrop Analytics office," he asked. "Yes." David scanned the timestamps. Logan Northrop, 11:17 p.m. entry. Emily Carter, 11:18 p.m. entry. Logan Northrop, 12:42 a.m. exit. Emily Carter, 12:43 a.m. exit. Several dates repeated the pattern. David leaned back slightly. "Were these meetings scheduled?" he asked. "No, and the expenses tied to those dates. Several late-night charges appear on the corporate card." David tapped a pen against the desk thoughtfully. Again, he said carefully, "None of this proves misconduct." "I understand," Lydia replied. "But it raises compliance questions." "Yes." David closed the binder halfway and studied Lydia quietly. "May I ask something directly?" "Of course." "Why are you pursuing this personally instead of filing an internal compliance review?" Lydia did not hesitate. "Because once the review begins, the narrative becomes public." David understood the implication. Northrop Analytics was not just a business entity. It was Lydia's husband's company. Corporate investigations rarely remained quiet. If these patterns are confirmed as misuse of company funds, David said, the board would need to be notified. "I know." "And if personal relationships influence those expenses, that could also create governance concerns." "Yes." David closed the binder. "For now," he said, "you're doing the correct thing. Continue documenting. Do not confront anyone involved." Lydia nodded. David added, "If the pattern continues, the next step would be formal disclosure to the board or the company's external legal counsel." "Understood." They sat in silence for a moment. Finally, David asked one more question. "Does Logan know you're reviewing these records?" "No." David nodded slowly. "That may be wise for now." Across the city, Logan Northrop was finishing a late afternoon meeting with Emily Carter. The office building had grown quieter as most employees prepared to leave for the evening. Logan leaned against the conference table while reviewing the latest investor projections. "These numbers look good," he said. Emily stood beside him, adjusting a few lines in the presentation. "If we secure the Midwest banking contracts early next year, the growth curve will accelerate," she said. Logan smiled. "That's exactly what investors want to hear." Emily closed the laptop. "You've built something strong here," she said. Logan appreciated that kind of acknowledgement. It felt earned. For years, he had carried the responsibility of keeping the company alive. The early uncertainty, the endless investor meetings, the pressure of convincing people the company deserved their money. Now the success felt real. And Emily had been instrumental in organizing the strategy behind the expansion. "You've helped a lot," Logan said. Emily shrugged lightly. "Just doing my job." But Logan noticed the faint satisfaction in her expression. Outside the office windows, the city lights flickered on as evening arrived. Meanwhile, Lydia returned home and sat once again at her desk. The meeting with David had confirmed something important. The documents she had gathered were no longer simply observations. They were evidence that required structure. She opened her laptop and began organizing the files for digital storage. Each record was scanned, each timestamp verified, each document labeled carefully. Then Lydia created a new document, Disclosure Draft Preliminary. The page remained blank for several seconds while she considered how to begin. Finally, she typed a single sentence. "This document summarizes irregularities observed in executive expense reports and related records associated with Northrop Analytics during the past 6 months." She stopped typing. The words felt precise, but they carried weight. Once a disclosure existed in written form, it could not easily disappear. Lydia saved the document without continuing. For now, preparation was enough. Across Chicago, Logan finished dinner with Emily at a restaurant near the office. The conversation had begun as a discussion about strategy, but gradually shifted into something more relaxed. They spoke about the company's future, about investors, about how quickly Northrop Analytics had grown. Logan felt comfortable, confident, the kind of confidence that comes when success appears stable. Neither of them discussed compliance reports. Neither of them considered the possibility that corporate expenses might one day be examined closely. Inside her quiet office at home, Lydia reviewed the final entries in the chronological file. The timeline stretched across multiple pages now. Travel dates, expense records, building access logs, conference footage. Each piece alone was ordinary. Together they formed a story waiting to be understood. Lydia closed the binder and placed it beside her laptop. Outside the window, snow had begun falling again over the city. She watched it for a moment before turning off the desk lamp. The room faded into darkness. The records remained exactly where she had left them, carefully organized, patiently waiting. The email took Lydia Northrop 3 days to finish, not because the information was unclear, but because clarity required restraint. Each sentence had to remain factual. Each statement had to rest on documentation that could stand on its own without interpretation. Emotion had no place in compliance language. Lydia sat at her desk early Monday morning, reviewing the final draft. Outside her window, Chicago was waking slowly beneath a pale winter sky. Commuter traffic hummed in the distance, while the first light reflected faintly against the glass towers downtown. Her laptop screen displayed the subject line: Subject request for board-level compliance review. Northrop Analytics. She reread the first paragraph. This message is intended to notify the board and external counsel of several irregularities observed in executive expense records and related documentation associated with Northrop Analytics during the past 6 months. No accusations, no speculation, only facts. Below the opening paragraph, Lydia had organized the concerns into 3 categories. 1. Incomplete expense documentation. Several executive travel expenses were categorized as client meetings without the names or organizations of the clients involved. Supporting documentation was absent in multiple reports. 2. Expense timing irregularities. Certain charges recorded on corporate credit accounts occurred outside scheduled conference or meeting hours, including late-night transportation and dining expenses not tied to documented business events. 3. Building access correlation. Digital access logs from the Northrop Analytics Office indicated repeated late-night entries by senior executives during dates corresponding with undocumented expenses. Each point was followed by references to the supporting files. Lydia had attached 40 documents, expense reports, travel confirmations, calendar comparisons, building access logs, conference footage timestamps. Every file had been labeled carefully. She scrolled to the final paragraph. At this stage, I am not asserting misconduct. However, the patterns described above warrant formal review under standard corporate governance procedures. I am submitting these records to ensure transparency and proper oversight. She paused for a moment. Then she added the recipients. Victor Langley, Board Member Sandra Whitmore, Venture Partner Northrop Analytics, External Counsel David Klein, Compliance Counsel. Lydia leaned back in her chair. The email remained unsent. Once it was delivered, the matter would no longer remain private. Corporate boards were obligated to investigate potential compliance issues once formally notified. Internal audits would begin. Questions would follow. But Lydia had spent years working in environments where silence protected problems rather than people. Documentation existed for a reason. She looked once more at the subject line. Then she pressed send. The message left her outbox quietly. Across the city, Logan Northrop arrived at the Northrop Analytics office feeling unusually optimistic. The previous week's investor conversations had gone well. Several potential partners had expressed interest in the company's regional banking expansion strategy. He stepped into his office carrying a coffee while Emily Carter followed a few steps behind him with a tablet in hand. Victor confirmed the board call for Wednesday, Emily said. He wants to review the expansion timeline again. Logan nodded. That's fine. We're ready. Emily opened the presentation file. I've updated the projections. Logan glanced at the screen. The numbers looked strong. Revenue curves rising steadily, market share expanding across regional financial institutions. The future appeared orderly. Emily looked up from the tablet. You seem confident this morning. Logan smiled. I am. He meant it. The company had reached a stage where success felt predictable. The early years of uncertainty were gone. Now the only question seemed to be how quickly the company would grow. Downstairs in the building's administrative office, the company's external legal counsel opened their inbox and saw Lydia's message. The subject line immediately drew attention. Compliance notifications sent to board members were never routine. The attorney opened the email carefully. The attachments followed. Expense reports, access logs, chronological timelines. Within minutes, the attorney forwarded the message to Victor Langley with a short note. Victor, we need to review this immediately. Victor Langley received the email while sitting in his office overlooking the Chicago River. He read the message slowly. Victor had spent 30 years working in financial oversight roles. He recognized the language Lydia used. Measured, precise, professional, not emotional. Those qualities made the report more serious, not less. He opened several of the attachments. Expense reports without client documentation. Access logs showing late-night building entries. Patterns aligned across multiple dates. Victor did not jump to conclusions, but he also understood the responsibility of board oversight. He forwarded the email to Sandra Whitmore with a brief message. Sandra, we need a discussion today. At the Northrop Analytics office, Logan stepped into the executive meeting room with Emily and 2 department heads. The meeting began normally. Product updates, hiring discussions, marketing timelines. No one in the room yet knew that Lydia's email was circulating quietly through the company's governance structure. Halfway through the meeting, Logan's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen. Victor Langley. Logan frowned slightly. Victor rarely called during work hours without scheduling something first. Excuse me, Logan said to the team. He stepped into the hallway and answered. Victor's voice remained calm. Logan. I just received a compliance notification regarding corporate expenses. Logan paused. Expenses, yes, Victor said. Documentation issues connected to executive travel and late-night office access. Logan felt a flicker of confusion. I'm not aware of any issues. That may be the case, Victor replied. But we'll need to review the documentation. I'd like to schedule a board discussion later today. Logan hesitated. Who filed the notification? Victor answered without hesitation. Lydia Northrop. For the first time that morning, Logan felt uncertainty move through his thoughts. Lydia? He repeated. Yes, Victor said. She attached detailed records. Logan looked down the hallway toward the conference room where Emily and the other executives were waiting. What exactly does the report say? Logan asked. It doesn't accuse anyone, Victor replied. But the patterns require explanation. Logan ended the call slowly. He stood in the hallway for several seconds, processing what Victor had said. Lydia had submitted a compliance review. He had not even known she was reviewing company records. Inside her quiet home office across the city, Lydia closed her laptop after confirming the email had been delivered. She did not check for responses. The work she needed to do was finished. What happened next would follow corporate procedure. For years, Lydia had understood something Logan had gradually forgotten. Power inside companies did not only belong to those who stood on stages. Sometimes it belonged to the person who kept the records. And now the records were no longer silent. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere inside Northrop Analytics had changed in ways few employees could immediately explain. Nothing visible had happened. No announcements had been made. No meetings had been canceled. Yet subtle signals moved quietly through the office, like a shift in pressure before a storm. Logan Northrop noticed the change first in the tone of his inbox. 2 emails from the company's external legal counsel appeared within minutes of each other. The first was brief. Subject: board review. Compliance documentation. Logan, the board, has received a compliance notification referencing executive expense records and related documentation. We will need to discuss the material formally this afternoon. The second email arrived seconds later. Please confirm your availability for a 4:30 p.m. board call. Logan read the messages twice. Across the hallway, Emily Carter stepped into his office carrying a printed agenda for their upcoming strategy meeting. Ready to continue? She asked. Logan hesitated before answering. Victor called earlier, he said. Emily paused. What about compliance review? The word hung briefly in the room. Emily frowned slightly. Compliance. Logan nodded. Something about expense documentation and building access logs. Emily's expression remained calm, but her eyes sharpened. Is there a problem I don't know yet? Logan leaned back in his chair. Victor said Lydia filed the report. Emily said nothing for a moment. Then she asked quietly, Why would Lydia review company expenses? Logan shook his head. I have no idea. The statement was technically true. For years, Lydia had kept her distance from the company's daily operations. Logan had assumed she no longer involved herself in those details. Now it seemed she had been watching far more carefully than he realized. Emily placed the printed agenda on Logan's desk. Well, she said evenly, documentation issues happen. Someone probably forgot to include a few client names on expense reports. Logan wanted to believe that explanation. But Victor Langley's tone during the phone call had been too measured for a minor oversight. Victor rarely reacted strongly unless something required serious attention. What exactly did Lydia send? Logan asked. Emily crossed her arms lightly. Can you access the report? Logan opened his inbox and located Lydia's email. He hesitated before clicking the attachment. The document opened slowly. Page after page of organized records appeared on the screen. Expense reports, travel confirmations, building access logs, conference footage timestamps, everything arranged chronologically. Logan's eyes moved across the dates. Denver, San Francisco, Austin, late-night entries into the office building, corporate card charges tied to those same dates. Emily stepped closer to the desk, reading the document over Logan's shoulder. The room fell silent. After several seconds, Logan leaned back in his chair. This looks Thorough, he said. Emily remained composed. She's organized, she said quietly. Logan scrolled further down the report. The final page summarized the issue in careful language. The records above indicate patterns that may warrant review under corporate governance procedures. No accusations, no conclusions, only documentation. Logan rubbed his forehead. She went straight to the board. Emily spoke carefully. That's unusual. Logan gave a short laugh that carried no humor. Yes. Across the city, Victor Langley sat in his office reviewing the same documents again. Sandra Whitmore joined the call from her New York office. The company's external legal counsel also joined the meeting. Victor spoke first. We're not here to assign blame, he said calmly. But once a compliance notification reaches the board, we're obligated to review it. Sandra agreed. The documentation is detailed, she said. That alone requires attention. The legal counsel summarized the situation. Several expense entries lack proper documentation. The access logs show repeated late-night entries by executives on dates tied to those expenses. At this stage, we simply need explanations. Victor nodded. Logan will join the call shortly. Back at the Northrop Analytics office, Logan ended another phone call with the company's CFO. Finance says the expense reports were approved internally, Logan said. Emily responded quickly. Approved by me, she said. Logan looked at her. That's part of your authority now. Yes. Were those client dinners legitimate? Emily's voice remained calm. They were business discussions. With who? Emily hesitated briefly. Potential partners. Early conversations. Logan noticed the pause. Where they documented, Emily looked away toward the window. Not formally. Logan sighed. This is exactly the kind of thing compliance teams hate. Emily turned back toward him. It's not illegal to have informal business discussions, I know, Logan said. But when corporate cards are involved, documentation matters. Emily said nothing. At 4:30 p.m., Logan joined the board call. Victor Langley appeared on the screen along with Sandra Whitmore and the company's legal counsel. The tone of the meeting remained professional. Victor began. Logan, thank you for joining us. Of course, Logan said. Victor continued. As you've likely seen, Lydia submitted documentation related to executive expense records. Logan nodded. I reviewed the report. Sandra spoke next. We're not assuming misconduct, but we do need clarity. The legal counsel summarized the main questions. Several expense entries lacked client documentation. Late-night office access occurred on those same dates. Corporate governance procedures required explanation. Logan answered calmly. Most of those dinners involved informal partner discussions during conferences. Were those partners documented? Sandra asked. Not consistently. Victor folded his hands. That's something we'll need to correct. The discussion continued for nearly 40 minutes. Questions, clarifications, process explanations. At no point did Lydia speak. She had not joined the call. Her role in the meeting had ended when the documentation arrived. Finally, Victor concluded. At this stage, we'll initiate a standard internal review. Logan nodded. That's reasonable. The call ended shortly afterward. Logan sat alone in the conference room for a moment. The company had survived investor pressure, market competition, and technical challenges. Now the first serious governance review had begun. It wasn't a crisis, but it wasn't nothing either. Across the city, Lydia Northrop closed a notebook after writing a single line. Board review initiated. She placed the notebook inside the binder containing the chronological records. Then she stood and walked to the window. Snow continued falling over Chicago's evening skyline. Quiet, steady. For years, Lydia had understood something Logan had gradually forgotten. Success did not eliminate accountability. It only delayed the moment when accountability arrived. And now, that moment had begun. The internal review began quietly. For most employees at Northrop Analytics, nothing appeared different during the following week. Meetings, continued project deadlines remained unchanged, and the company's expansion strategy moved forward on paper exactly as it had before. But inside the company's governance structure, the atmosphere had shifted. Victor Langley requested that an external forensic accounting firm examine the expense records Lydia had submitted. Sandra Whitmore supported the decision immediately. Neither of them accused anyone directly, but both had spent decades inside financial institutions where small irregularities often revealed deeper problems once examined closely. Logan received the formal notice 2 days after the board call. The email came from the company's external legal counsel. Subject: Internal Review Procedures. Logan, as discussed during the board meeting, an independent review of executive expense documentation will begin this week. This process is standard when governance concerns are raised. We ask that all relevant travel and expense records be preserved. Logan stared at the message for several seconds. Across the office, Emily Carter was reviewing the quarterly strategy report. Legal confirmed the review, she asked, when she saw his expression. Yes. Emily set down the report. They'll go through the expense records and access logs, Logan said. Emily leaned back slightly in her chair. Then they'll see the same thing we did. A few incomplete receipts. Logan wasn't entirely sure it would remain that simple. Compliance investigations had a way of expanding once auditors began asking questions. Just cooperate, he said. Provide whatever documentation they ask for. Emily nodded. That's fine. She sounded confident. Across Chicago, Lydia received a brief message from David Klein, confirming the board's decision. The review is proceeding. That's expected given the documentation you submitted. Lydia read the email calmly. She had anticipated the outcome the moment she pressed send on the compliance notification. Now the matter belonged to corporate procedure rather than personal observation. Inside the offices of the forensic accounting firm hired by the board, 3 auditors began reviewing the files. Their work was methodical. They compared corporate card statements with reimbursement reports. They matched travel schedules against meeting documentation. They analyzed timestamps from the building access logs. At first, the results appeared exactly as expected. Most expenses were legitimate. Conference registrations, hotel stays, transportation. But several entries raised questions. One San Francisco trip included 3 dinners categorized as client meetings, yet no client names appeared in the reports. Another trip to Denver included transportation charges hours after the final conference session ended. The auditors requested additional documentation. Emails confirming business meetings, names of attendees, supporting receipts, while Logan forwarded the request to Emily. They want documentation for the conference dinners, he said. Emily scanned the email. I'll respond. She typed a short explanation. Several discussions during those trips involved informal conversations with potential partners and investors. No formal contracts were discussed, which is why the documentation may appear incomplete. The auditors accepted the response temporarily, but they continued examining the timeline Lydia had provided. The building access logs caught their attention next. Late-night entries. Logan Northrop, 11:17 p.m. Emily Carter, 11:18 p.m. Logan Northrop, 12:42 a.m. exit. Emily Carter, 12:43 a.m. exit. 3 separate nights showed the same pattern. The auditors checked the company's meeting calendar. No executive sessions had been scheduled during those hours. They requested security footage from the building's lobby cameras. Meanwhile, the review expanded to include archived emails connected to the executive travel reports. The auditors were not looking for personal relationships. They were looking for governance risks. But sometimes the two overlapped. One recovered email thread contained a short exchange between Emily and Logan during the Austin conference. Emily, dinner tonight. There's a quiet place near the hotel. Logan, let's call it a strategy discussion. The message itself proved nothing. But when matched with the expense report for that same evening, it became part of a larger pattern. Across the city, Lydia sat in her home office reviewing a simple legal document. It was a draft prepared by David Klein. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Lydia had not filed it yet. But she understood something important. Corporate governance investigations had a way of uncovering personal truths. Once auditors began tracing records, relationships often became visible through patterns of travel expense and communication. She closed the document and placed it back in the folder. The decision would come later. At the Northrop Analytics office, tension had begun creeping into the executive floor. Employees sensed something unusual, even if they didn't know the details. Legal staff moved quietly between offices. Auditors requested additional records. The company's finance department had been instructed to preserve all expense documentation from the previous year. Logan tried to maintain normal operations. He continued leading meetings. He continued presenting the expansion strategy. But the confidence he felt only a week earlier had begun to fade. One evening, after most employees had left, Logan stood in his office looking out across the city lights. Emily entered quietly. "The auditors asked for more emails," she said. Logan nodded. "That's normal." Emily watched him carefully. "Do you think Lydia expects this to go further?" Logan did not answer immediately. He remembered the moment Victor Langley mentioned Lydia's name during the first phone call. The calm tone, the certainty. "She wouldn't have sent the report if she didn't believe the records mattered," Logan said finally. Emily crossed her arms. "Then she's trying to make a point." "Maybe." Logan turned back toward the window. He still didn't understand how Lydia had assembled such a detailed file. For years, he had assumed she had moved on from the company's operations. Now he realized something different. She had never stopped observing. Across Chicago, Lydia closed the binder containing the chronological records. The internal review was no longer under her control. It belonged to the auditors now. But Lydia understood something about investigations. Evidence did not shout. It accumulated, quietly, patiently, until eventually the truth no longer needed interpretation, and the auditors reviewing Northrop Analytics records were moving closer to that point with every document they examined. The forensic audit report arrived at the end of January. Snow had settled heavily across Chicago that week, covering sidewalks and office windows with a quiet white layer that softened the city's constant movement. Inside the offices of Northrop Analytics, however, nothing felt soft. The report had been delivered directly to the board. Victor Langley read it first, then Sandra Whitmore, then the company's external legal counsel. Only after that did Logan receive a copy. The document was nearly 60 pages long. Unlike Lydia's carefully neutral timeline, the auditor's report carried formal conclusions. The investigation had reviewed more than 800 expense entries, dozens of travel itineraries, corporate card statements, and archived email communications connected to executive activity over the past year. Most of the records had been ordinary, but several sections of the report were not. Logan read them slowly in his office, the winter light from the window barely touching the pages. The first finding was administrative. Incomplete expense documentation, multiple executive travel expenses, had been categorized as client meetings without the names of any clients recorded. In several cases, no follow-up documentation could confirm that business discussions had taken place. The second finding was more serious. Misclassification of corporate expenses. Certain meals, transportation charges, and hospitality expenses were determined to be personal in nature, but had been submitted under corporate accounts. The auditors had traced the charges to trips where Logan Northrop and Emily Carter had traveled together for conferences. The report stopped short of describing the relationship between them. But the pattern of expenses was clear. Late-night restaurant bills, private car services after official events had ended, hotel services billed to the corporate account, all approved internally, all lacking documentation connecting them to legitimate business activity. Logan closed his eyes briefly. Across the executive floor, Emily Carter sat in her office reading the same report. Her expression remained controlled, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed the reality she was processing. The auditors had not accused her of criminal misconduct. But they had concluded that company expense policies had been violated repeatedly. The final section of the report addressed governance concerns. Because Emily had approved several of the expense reports herself, while also benefiting from those expenses, the auditors determined that the company's internal approval structure had been compromised. Victor Langley called for an emergency board meeting that afternoon. Logan entered the conference room quietly. Sandra Whitmore appeared on the video screen from New York. The company's external counsel sat beside Victor. Emily was not present. Victor spoke calmly. "Logan, the audit results are clear." Logan nodded once. "Yes," Victor continued. "This is not a criminal matter, but the company's expense policies were violated." Sandra added gently, "And because those expenses were approved internally by the person benefiting from them, governance procedures were bypassed." Logan looked down at the report in front of him. "I understand." Victor leaned forward. "The board's responsibility is to protect the company." Logan nodded again. "What are you recommending?" The legal counsel spoke next. "Emily Carter should be suspended immediately pending further internal review." Logan felt the words settle heavily in the room. "And me?" he asked. Victor's voice remained steady. "The board is not recommending removal of the CEO at this time." But Victor paused before continuing. "However, the board will require full reimbursement of the misclassified expenses and immediate restructuring of executive expense oversight." Logan accepted the decision without argument. "I'll cooperate." Across the office floor, Emily received the same decision from Human Resources 20 minutes later. Her suspension would take effect immediately. She was asked to leave the building after gathering her personal belongings. The conversation remained professional. No accusations, no raised voices. Just procedure. Emily walked slowly down the hallway, carrying a small box of files. Employees glanced up as she passed. Some looked confused. Others avoided eye contact. Logan watched from his office doorway as Emily reached the elevator. Neither of them spoke. The doors closed quietly. Across the city, Lydia Northrop received a short email from David Klein. "The audit results have been delivered. The board has acted accordingly." Lydia read the message without reaction. The consequences unfolding inside Northrop Analytics were no longer part of her work. She had provided documentation. The company's governance structure had responded. Now the outcome belonged to the people involved. Later that evening, Logan drove home earlier than usual. The house felt unusually quiet when he stepped inside. Lydia was sitting at the dining table with a folder placed neatly in front of her. She looked up as Logan entered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Logan placed his coat on the chair. "I read the audit report," he said. Lydia nodded. "I expected you would." Logan sat down across from her. "You've been reviewing the company records for months." "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" Lydia answered calmly. "You made the announcement publicly." Logan understood immediately what she meant. The night at the Drake Hotel, the applause, Emily standing beside him on stage. "You could have come to me first," he said quietly. Lydia met his eyes. "And asked you to review your own expense reports." Logan had no answer. The silence in the room felt heavy, but not hostile. Lydia opened the folder in front of her and slid a document across the table. Logan looked down. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." He stared at the page. "You're filing for divorce?" "Yes." Logan looked up again. "You're not angry?" "No." Then why? Lydia spoke with the same calm tone she had used throughout the entire process. "Because trust requires transparency." Logan looked down at the document again. "You built the company with me," he said quietly. Lydia shook her head slightly. "No." Logan frowned. "You helped from the beginning." "I supported you," she said. "But the company belongs to you." Logan looked as if he wanted to say something more. But Lydia closed the folder gently. "The auditors did their work," she said. "The board made its decision." And now Logan asked. Lydia stood. "Now I leave." There was no anger in her voice, only finality. Logan watched as Lydia walked toward the hallway. The house felt larger than it had ever seemed before. And for the first time since the company began, Logan realized something he had never fully understood. The quietest person in the room had always been the one paying the closest attention. Spring arrived slowly in Chicago that year. The snow melted in uneven patches along sidewalks and city parks, leaving behind wet pavement and the first hesitant signs of green beneath the trees. The air no longer carried the sharp bite of winter, but the city had not yet fully returned to warmth. Inside Northrop Analytics, the season of change had already begun. The board had implemented several structural adjustments following the audit. Corporate expense approvals were reassigned to the finance department rather than executive staff. External compliance oversight was added to review travel documentation. The company's legal counsel updated governance policies to prevent future conflicts of interest. Emily Carter's suspension quietly became a formal resignation. The announcement to employees was brief. Emily Carter has stepped down from her role as Deputy Executive Officer. We thank her for her contributions and wish her well in her future endeavors. No details were shared. The company preferred stability over public explanations. Logan Northrop remained CEO. The board had decided continuity mattered more than disruption. But the atmosphere around him had changed. Where conversations once carried easy confidence, they now moved with more caution. Meetings included additional oversight from finance and legal departments. Expense approvals required documentation Logan had never previously considered necessary. None of these changes were dramatic, but they were constant reminders of the audit. Logan accepted them without protest. Responsibility had always been part of leadership. He simply had not expected it to arrive this way. Meanwhile, Lydia Northrop's life had begun moving quietly in another direction. The divorce proceedings unfolded without conflict. Both parties agreed to a straightforward settlement. Lydia did not seek control of Northrop Analytics or any involvement in the company's operations. Her financial settlement reflected the years she had spent supporting Logan during the early stages of the business, but the negotiations remained practical rather than emotional. David Klein managed the legal process with the same steady professionalism he had shown from the beginning. "There's no need to make this adversarial," he told Lydia during one meeting. "I agree," she said. Lydia moved into a smaller apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. The building was quiet, with wide windows that allowed the morning light to fill the rooms. She arranged her new office carefully desked near the window bookshelves along one wall, the same laptop she had used for years placed neatly at the center. For the first time in many years, the files on her computer no longer contained records of Northrop Analytics. Instead, they held consulting contracts. Several financial firms had approached Lydia after learning about her background in compliance and risk management. Word had circulated quietly among legal professionals about the thoroughness of the documentation she had assembled. One firm in particular, a mid-sized regulatory consulting group, offered Lydia a permanent position. She declined the full-time role. Instead, she accepted project-based work, reviewing corporate governance procedures for clients who needed careful oversight. The work suited her. Structured, independent, quiet. One afternoon in early May, Lydia sat at her desk reviewing a compliance report for a financial services firm in Boston. Outside the window, the lake reflected sunlight in bright patterns across the water. Her phone vibrated softly beside the laptop. A message from Logan appeared on the screen. She read it without urgency. Logan. "The divorce papers were finalized today?" Lydia typed a short reply. "Lydia, I received the confirmation." Several minutes passed before another message arrived. "Logan, I wanted to say something." Lydia waited. "Logan, I didn't understand how much you had done for the company until I started reviewing the early records again." She stared at the message quietly. Logan continued. "Logan, the early proposals, the contract revisions, the financial models, they all had your edits." Lydia did not respond immediately. The past no longer required correction. Finally, she typed a simple reply. Lydia, you built the company. I helped when it was needed. Across the city, Logan sat in his office reading her message. The Northrop Analytics headquarters looked much the same as it always had. Employees moved through the open workspace discussing product updates. Screens displayed market analytics and software dashboards. From the outside, the company appeared unchanged. But Logan had begun noticing details he once ignored. Legal language inside contracts, expense documentation requirements. The quiet importance of systems Lydia had once managed without recognition. On his desk lay a printed copy of the original Northrop Analytics proposal from 7 years earlier. He had opened the file weeks ago while preparing documents for the auditors. Now he could see the difference clearly. His original draft filled the first few pages. Ambitious, unstructured. Then the revisions began. Paragraphs rewritten, financial models corrected, regulatory language added in the margins. Lydia's handwriting appeared throughout the document. Careful, precise. He had once believed the company's success came from vision. Now he understood something else had been equally important. Discipline, documentation, patience. The qualities Lydia had carried quietly from the beginning. Logan picked up his phone again and typed one final message. Logan, thank you for what you did. The message appeared on Lydia's screen a few seconds later. She read it once. Then she set the phone down beside her laptop and returned to the report she had been reviewing. The lake outside her window moved gently under the afternoon wind. Life had continued, not with triumph, not with revenge, but with a quiet sense of completion. The records Lydia Northrop had kept for so many years had finally spoken for themselves. And when they were finished, she simply closed the files and walked forward with the same calm dignity she had carried all along. In many stories about power and betrayal, the ending arrives with noise arguments, humiliation, or revenge delivered in public. But the truth rarely moves that way. More often, it moves quietly, through records kept carefully, through decisions made with patience rather than anger, through the moment when someone realizes that dignity does not need applause to remain intact. Lydia Northrop never raised her voice. She never tried to destroy Logan's reputation. She simply documented what existed and allowed the system to see it clearly. In the end, the company corrected its mistakes. The board restored its oversight, and Lydia walked away with something that no position or title could offer. Her integrity remained untouched. Stories like this remind us that silence does not always mean weakness. Sometimes it means someone is watching closely, waiting for the moment when the truth no longer needs to be defended. If this story stayed with you until the end, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from today? What time is it where you are? And if you appreciate stories about patience, justice, and quiet strength, you're welcome to subscribe so you won't miss the next one.